Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm the editor-in-chief with Signature Leadership by Knowledge Hook. And welcome. We're really thrilled to have you here and joining us today. Our topic for today's roundtable is building student and educator well-being. And this is a topic that has been near and dear to our heart. We've had lots of sessions on this topic. And what I really like about the topic today is that we're combining not only student well-being, but educator well-being. So thrilled to have you here. Please take the time to jump on and introduce yourself and let us know where you're coming to us from. The only thing you have to remember is to scroll down to having it sent out to everyone instead of just panelists. So if you can be doing that now in the chat, that would be great. So we have three partners that have got together for the SEL Global Leadership Series. The first one is Knowledge Hook. And for those of you that are new to our series, you've created an account, and what you'll notice there on Signature Leadership is that there are 2.5 years of some incredible content. We've got great roundtables, great podcasts from great presenters like we have with us today. So feel free to jump on and enjoy, and that's our first partner. Our second partner is Karanga, and Karanga is the Global Alliance for Social Emotional Learning and Life Skills, and I'm an executive member on that organization. It is a great global look at what is happening in social emotional learning and life skills, not only in North America, of course, but right around the world. And our third partner is Salzburg Global Seminar. Salzburg Global Seminar is a think tank out of Austria, and it emerged after the Second World War. And it was a family from Austria and a couple of Americans that decided that the world needed a think tank to be creating future leaders that would leave the world in a better place. And I'm sorry to say that was back in 1947. And based on what we see in the world today, obviously still a huge need for organizations like that. They've got fellows from in 80 countries around 180 countries around the world, and they do work in education and health and financial systems, and it's really the idea of training future leaders. So those are our three sponsors for today, and we're going to dive into what today will look like. So we have registrants from 6 Canadian provinces and territories, from 21 states across the US, and from 12 different countries. So welcome to all of you. And as those of you who have participated before, super fun, jump in the chat, introduce yourselves, and don't hesitate to ask questions and comments, because Shawn and Farima will be happy to help you out with those. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Shawn and Farima. And Shawn is going to be talking. I've begged Shawn to be talking about his new book. And it's not very often where I read a book where I think, wow, that one is one that educators should really be listening and reading about. So Shawn will share a little bit about that and some of the research and work that he's done. He is from the University of San Francisco, but he has just been appointed as the Endowed Chair at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And a huge congratulations, Shawn. We're super happy to have you here. Farima, and I'll talk a little bit more as we introduce Farima as well, but Farima's an assistant professor, has worked with Shawn for years, and part of Flourish Agenda, which is a really interesting organization. So enough from me. Welcome, Shawn.
Welcome. Thank you, Jennifer, and great to see you, Farima. I'm glad to be here. Just glad to be here.
That's great. Shawn, share us a little bit of some of the work that you've been doing.
Well, most of my career has been focused on working with young people of color and trying to support their transformation about the ways in which our society and our schools have harmed them. And over the past 25 years or so, I've learned a few things that really providing the supports that are necessary to heal young people. It's also necessary to think about healing the adults that surround them. And so my work has been about trying to articulate the kinds of changes that we need to make as adults to transform the systems that young people find themselves in.
Such incredibly important work, Shawn. And, it doesn't matter what school system you are in. I'm from Ottawa, Canada, and we have groups of students that have had a very hard time in our school systems, and lots of dedicated educators. And, the people that are with us today are example of people that want to be doing a better job for those kids. So that's what today is going to be about. And Shawn, I think you had a couple of slides that you were going to share with us.
Sure. So I want to start with discussion about some ideas that come from my new book called The Four Pivots. And the book is really about, the book really came about trying to understand what really matters in changing the systems where young people find themselves. And I have been invited to do consulting for school districts and schools around the country around DEI work. And what I have found is that much of the DEI work is so surface, Jennifer and Farima. It's like hanging a poster in a classroom and saying that's DEI work, and expecting that the school or the systems change. And I became frustrated, that there's something much more fundamental and deeper that needs to occur for change to have greater influence on the lives of the adults and the young people who are oftentimes trying to navigate these harmful systems. And so I wrote the book really for me. I wrote the book for me because I was trained as an activist and trained as an educator to really have a gaze on education as a problem to be solved that was external from myself. And I did not have the tools to actually understand how my journey in trying to provide educational opportunities for young people had an impact on my own well-being, my own stress, friends and family that I have lost because we didn't give them permission to take a break, dismissing my own and others' stress in classrooms as if, just suck it up and get through it. And more recently, the wearing impact on seeing Black and brown children in schools, in neighborhoods, having to navigate gun violence, and more recently, school shootings, that wearing impact on myself. I wrote this book for me. And that means that I needed to reflect on the most important lessons that I've learned about my own transformation and continued transformation, and how that translates into the systems where young people find themselves. So I want to quickly outline the concepts in the four pivots. And first of all, I call them the four pivots because they're subtle changes that have a profound impact on our own lives and in the systems that we want to have an impact on. And so we cannot change systems fundamentally. We can never change a school until we transform ourselves. And that means that we can't create the systems that we want in the current versions of who we are as educators. We are not just educators. We are not just teachers. We're not just principals. We're human beings that are in an environment that we believe we can change the system with the professional titles that we have. And so this book is pushing us to think about the humanistic ways in which we need to center our humanity and allow for that humanity to drive the systems and the policies and the procedures that are necessary to center young people's lives. Now, so the first, I call them a pivot because they're subtle. And the first pivot is a pivot that I call a pivot from lens to mirror, right? These are, what I mean by a lens to mirror is that a lens is an outward look. It's an analysis of the challenges and the problems and the issues that we see in our schools. It allows us to understand and describe school suspensions, racism in schools, homophobia, curricular issues. It's a lens, that's an outward look. That's what I learned in graduate school. And that's primarily how I came to see education, as an analysis of issues that problems to be fixed. But what I didn't get is the deeper reflection about who I am about how I'm feeling, about my own insecurities, about my own worries, or with my own children, Jennifer. I raised a 6'3" African-American boy in Oakland, California, and I was dismissing my own concerns about my own child's safety in the city that I raised him, because he's tall, and I was concerned that the police might not know he's my baby boy, right? So
Shawn, I've raised a 6'5" son, but I often think, and I often talk to him about how privileged he is, that I don't have to worry about his safety in the same way that I'm sure you think about your son's safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
And so mirror work is just really about ongoing, deep self-reflection. It implicates us. It makes us ask questions about our own trauma, Jennifer, our own issues that we need to heal from, about why we're not talking to our parents, or why we've cut off our relationship with our cousins or whatever. But mirror work doesn't lie. And it forces us to kind of grapple with the ways that we've been wounded. And the purpose is that once we grapple with that, we could show up differently. The second pivot is a pivot from transactional to transformative relationships. And we know that, we know that relationships are everything, but we don't necessarily get trained in graduate schools of education or in our teacher education programs how to cultivate transformative relationships. We know transactional relationships, which is the teacher versus the student, the teacher versus the parent, the principal, right? These are titles that we have as human. We sit in, these professional titles. But transformative relationships are not built based on our professional titles. They're cultivated through our humanity. When we're vulnerable with one another, when we share with one another, when we cultivate empathy and compassion. And so when I talk about transformative relationships, the question is how are we cultivating transformative relationships in schools and classrooms? Not just relationships, but transformative relationships. The third pivot is a pivot from problem to possibility, right? And we know that there are a number of problems, and part of what the conditions of schools, primarily schools where Black and brown children find themselves, is that there are a lot of problems to be solved, but as leaders, our job is not to only engage in problem solving. We also have to use and cultivate that muscle of possibility creating, the capacity for us as leaders to dream and imagine beyond the conditions that exist in front of us. This is the lessons from King, and this is the lessons from Ella Baker, that we have to address the problem, but we also have to dream beyond it. Because when we dream beyond it, we begin to create the pathways to its possibility. The last and final pivot is this pivot from hustle to flow. And we know, this pivot is suggesting that we cannot achieve deep transformative work in frenzy mode, right? That we can't create deep change in a 2-year strategic plan. It means that we have to be more mindful of how we use our time, of how what does it take for us to engage in flow? And flow means that we're just more mindful of how we're using time, how we're cultivating a sense of rest, right? A sense of well-being in our classrooms and schools. And so this pivot from hustle to flow is an intentional shift to slow down so that our change, our efforts, our engagement with one another can have deeper impact on the young people and the adults in the systems that we want to transform. I'll stop
Shawn,
there.
I so appreciate that you've highlighted this. And one of the things I loved in the introduction is that you talked about how your wife badgered you into writing this book.
Yeah.
I'm sure she thought, Shawn, you've got to get this down on paper because it'll be good for you and it will be good for, other educators, et cetera, out there, but also your own, like you said, your own personal healing and the journey, kind of anecdoting what's happened in your personal journey.
Well, I started off as an academic book, and then my wife was like, I'm not going to read that, and nobody else will. So after 3 months of writing, and having her read it, I scratched it and started writing it in a different way. So.
And Shawn, that's every district that I've been in the last 3 months, I've talked about this book because that's what's different about this professional book. It's not a classic professional book. It is a weaving of a story. You do a really nice job of we get to know you throughout your journey, but it is also connected to these 4 main thoughts. And while they're very helpful for educators and school leaders to be thinking about this and the impact on education, it's really relevant for any organization to be thinking about how do we really value the individuals? How do we give people time to be thinking about themselves? And then thinking about some of those 4 pivots. So it goes beyond education, but it's a great one for education for sure.
Thanks, Jennifer.
I'm going to switch over to Farima, and Farima has been doing amazing work with Shawn for many years and is part of an organization, Flourish Agenda. Farima, welcome. Super happy to have you here, and let's hear a little bit about your work.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor to share space with my dear mentor, Shawn. We've done this work for quite some time. And when we first met, just a side note, story, we met because his son was in a high school program that would travel abroad to do community service work and learning. And I was one of the educators that received an award, and we met there.
Nice.
And it was beautiful. And we've been rocking together ever since. And I'm really, really grateful for the relationship that we've cultivated and how this work has grown and evolved over a decade and more, right? And so I just want to share, a lot of the work that I do is in community organizations that are really committed to creating change in education. And many of them are situated outside of schools. Okay. And that was a political choice for me, knowing that I was going to need to navigate institutions that sometimes are a little rigid and difficult to change from the inside. And so I wrote a piece with some comrades where we talked about, it's called Educator Activism as a Shared Struggle for Human Being. And what we say is that we have a shared common purpose, and our collective purpose is human being. And we use that word as a verb and not a noun because our activism is actually the struggle for our human right to be liberated from any project of violence that treats us as anything less than human. So what does that look like curricularly? What does that look like within institutions? What does that look like interpersonally in classrooms and beyond, right? So really, when I think of healing-centered work situated in education, I see healing-centered engagement as essentially cycle-breaking work. And what do I mean by that? In Flourish Agenda and in the work that we do together, when we're talking about healing-centered engagement, we understand this situated within an ecosystem, right? We were all born into a society that was already shaped by these different forms of oppression that Shawn was talking about. And so we would be fools to believe that we are not impacted or shaped by these different forms of oppression, that we are not socialized, that in some way, shape, or form, we don't internalize some of these beliefs as truths, right? And the reality is that as we navigate relationships, these different forms of oppression show up in the ways that we navigate our relationships, whether that's with our students, our colleagues, our own family members, our most intimate relationships, because oftentimes there's a struggle for power over someone as opposed to power with, or even power within, right? Because that's just the way that we've been socialized under domination. And then, of course, we're in these institutions and we're trying to create change, but many of the policies, practices, and values replicate the very things that we're trying to fight against. And so Shawn talks about in an article that he wrote in 2020 about this idea of many folks having to exist within persistent traumatic stress environments. That he reframes this idea of, folks suffering from PTSD, right? As like this individualized experience and really situating it as this much larger issue that's addressing the root causes of some of the health disparities that we're experiencing and the things that get in the way of our well-being, right? That it's not an individual thing, but it's actually because of policies that make people experience greater stress and anxiety and depression because of the lack of safety and opportunities and housing that they need to be well, right? And so it becomes this never-ending cycle. So essentially, healing-centered engagement is about breaking the cycle of harm, right? It's about being able to cultivate space for healing at the individual level, at the interpersonal relational level, and at the institutional level, so that we can begin to imagine new possibilities. I think one of the things that's really important about healing-centered engagement work is that what we are doing is building new worlds together. And we can't do that if we don't create space for that. And so when he talks about the 4 pivots and constantly only focusing on problems, it doesn't make room for the possibilities that are available to us, right? So in Flourish Agenda and the work that we do with communities, organizations, educators, and beyond, we talk about the karma principles. And these are the principles of healing-centered engagement that help us to kind of hone in even more to those 4 pivots, right? What would it mean for us to look at our institutional cultures and how sometimes the cultures within the institutions that we are leading replicate some of the toxic norms of the dominant society? And then what would it look like to actually disrupt that and create space for us to celebrate different forms of being with one another, right? And how to celebrate each other's diversity and creating room, right, for different ways of being together. It's about agency and being able to create space to address the root causes and change those issues. He talks about relationship, and relationship isn't just about our relationship to others. It's also about the relationship we have to ourselves, the relationship we have to the land, the relationship we have to others, right? It's about finding meaning in the work that we do. Burnout oftentimes is caused because we've lost our meaning. There's no space for us to actually connect with our passion and our purpose and the work that we're doing. And so how do we make space for that in our organizational cultures as well? And of course, aspirations. This is where the dreaming happens. And so if we don't create space to actually name what it is that we want, then we get more of what we don't want, right? And so I actually want to use this time to talk more about why and how conflict is actually really important for us to center and deal with within our leadership, right? The idea that conflict is bad is actually rooted in trauma and it's rooted in white supremacy culture, because conflict is actually very generative if we allow it to create space for us to practice alignment with our values, if it allows us to practice boundaries that serve all of us so that we can see each other and be in better relation, right? It can create space to rewrite old narratives. And it also creates space to practice compassionate accountability. And oftentimes when we think about accountability, it can sound and feel punitive under the dominant culture, right? How we've been socialized around accountability. But actually, accountability can be a beautiful opportunity to have deeper transformative relationships with ourselves and with the work that we do and with the communities that we want to serve, right? And so conflict is inevitable. It is impossible for you to live in this world and not experience and encounter conflict. And it's actually necessary for our individual and relational and community healing and growth, right? And so part of the work that we have to do in our leadership and in our organizations is invite conflict to be a place of generative growth, right? And so some of the mirror work that Shawn talks about in the 4 pivots is around asking ourselves, when someone tells us that we have caused them harm in particular, what are the stories we tell ourselves when that happens? What do we notice that's happening in our mind, our body, our spirit? And how have we actually created the capacity to hold multiple truths, right? What does it look like to provide ourselves with the care that we need to be able to hold someone's truth in that way? What do we need in order to actually engage conflict in a way that allows us to be honest with ourselves and hold our own truths while and not abandon our truths, while also holding the fact that there are many ways to experience a single issue, right? And asking ourselves, who are we accountable to? But it's also about the interpersonal mirror questions, right? Asking, what do I actually need from this other person to be able to practice repair work together? What do they need from me? Does that person feel emotionally safe? Do I feel emotionally safe? And if not, what are the tools that we've already practiced or that we need to practice together in order for conflict to be generative, right? Is radical honesty a practice in our relational culture here in the organization that we're in? Have we been able to listen to one another's story in a way that allows for us to both feel seen and heard and valued and respected, right? What do we need in order to grow and build relationships? What is our track record and where do we need to pivot, right? But then there's also the community mirror questions, right? The organizational mirror questions. Do we even have a culture of practicing radical honesty as a community in this organization or in this institution or in this collective? What happens when people share their difficult truths? Who is the organization accountable to? Have we normalized responses that lean towards collective engagement, or do we tend to go towards distancing that person or isolating, right? What are the practices that we need to invite into our culture to make the community an accountable one? Are there practices that we need to unlearn, right? Do we need additional support? Do we need outside folks to help us to be in practice and in alignment of our values? Because that's also very real, right? Do we have protocols? Who do people turn to when harm happens? And are we able to respond in ways that consider the impact on the collective, right? So these are some of the questions that I think are actually really important to create transformative shifts in the work that we're doing within ourselves, within our relationships, within our organizations, and eventually also within the larger society that we're saying we want to recreate, reimagine, and the worlds that we want to build together. And I do believe and strongly believe that acknowledging and addressing conflict, while it is very difficult, I'll tell you, I've been part of 3 different accountability processes across 3 different organizations. And it takes a lot of work and it's really hard. And a lot of our past wounds show up in these processes. But when I tell you that it has completely changed our collectives from the inside out, that is the work. And so if we see conflict as a waste of time or as a disruption, then we don't create room for all of the teaching and the learning in real time that can occur when we actually create the space to do it in a way that is aligned with our visions for healing and justice and well-being in our communities. So thank you. That's what I want to share. And I'm looking forward to
Go, Farima. Go, Dr. Pour-Khorshid.
That was amazing, Farima. And I want to reassure the audience that we will, this will be an on-demand version. You'll get an email that has the link to this that you can be going back after, because as Farima's talking, I'm madly scribbling notes, and I can only imagine many of you are thinking, okay, what do I have to do, etc. So that will be really helpful. The other thing, Farima, I loved the slide with your karma. I think that that's a really nice piece. If you wouldn't mind dropping a link where people can see that. I think it's just a really nice framing of things. Both of you, Shawn and Farima, what I love about the work that you're doing is that you start off with the individual and really promoting that idea that every one of the kids in our schools, every one of the adults in our schools deserve to have time to be thinking about who they are, what their lived experience is, and bringing that forward so that then they can move on to the interpersonal relationships and thinking about things at a bigger level from system change. Tell me a little bit about that progression. Shawn, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had experiences with trying to change schools and systems in a conventional way, right? Which is the policy, the practice, tinkering around the edge. And I have seen experiences that are completely, I'm sorry, that are completely transformative, right? So the conflict that Farima is talking about, where I've seen adults transform their own trauma. They transform and held space for young people who were navigating and trying to transform their trauma. And so I've seen both, and have come to an awareness that the deep transformative spiritual human-based work is siloed and never present in the systems and the institutional work that needs to change. And I've worked in systems like, this is juvenile probation, man. Like, those are folks who are trained to lock kids up. Working in that system and hearing how those probation officers feel dehumanized in those systems because they want to actually be able to provide care. So we are human beings in systems that have not allowed us to be human beings, right? And changing the tinkering around the edge doesn't get us the full transformation that we need. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Jennifer.
No, it's exactly that. And it's very much lined up with the work on social emotional learning. The social emotional, I mean, you start with emotions. You start with, every human being has a full range of emotions that are all good emotions. Some of them are happier and less happy emotions, but they're all good. And we have to make sure that everyone feels comfortable feeling those emotions. It's part of what it means to be a human. And then moving on to that, the only way that you can move on to the social part or the interactive part is if you spend time with the individual first. And then you get to the point, and Farima, you talked about this, that idea of, what does that person that I'm interacting, what do they need from me? What do I need from that person? And really social emotional learning, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're saying right from the time that, children are learning those things in their homes. When they come into our school systems, we need to make sure that there's space to be able to have teachers feeling comfortable having kids walking through those processes right on into post-secondary and out into the world of work. So yeah, Shawn, no, that's exactly it. That really, how do we make sure as an institution that we're getting away from the policy piece and the research piece and actually getting into making it real in our classrooms? So no, right on. Farima, you talked about that interpersonal piece.
Yeah, I think it's just so important to remember that we can be doing equity work and in the same breath be causing harm, right? And so if we're not careful, what happens is that we can hide behind what Shawn talks about, right? We hide behind the lenses. We can be very articulate about what it is that we are trying to fight against. And so I have had experiences, and we talked about this, Shawn. I remember having a nice conversation with you on the patio deck about how there's these men that can talk about patriarchy and dismantling it, and in the same breath cut women off and not cite them in their work, or right. And so it's one thing to intellectualize these things. It's another thing to be in practice of what it means for us relationally. And I think so much of this is about us really being reflective about how we've been wounded by the very systems that we're trying to dismantle or address, right, and heal. And they can be the most subtle moments where we have to pause and check in with ourselves, like, what's going on in this relationship right now? And by us kind of taking that pause and asking ourselves, what is the shift that's happened and actually addressing it, it's an invitation to transformation, as opposed to how we've been kind of socialized to avoid. Because what happens is we tend to think, if I've caused someone harm, then I'm bad. But the reality is we all cause harm. And if we don't start to normalize that, then we invest in this binary of good versus bad, evil versus, wrong versus right. And then there's no space for nuance, and there's no space for humanity, and there's no space for that gray area that is actually very necessary for the transformation to happen.
Farima, go ahead, Shawn, jump.
Oh, and this is, just right on. Preach, Farima. You know, that there's, and we don't learn how to do that, right? And so like mirror work is a way, it's a practice. It's not like a training, it's a practice. My wife says, I call it 4 pivots, but she says I should have put the 5th one in there, but it's kind of in the back. And that's the pivot around the dance between accountability and grace. And what Farima, what you're talking about is that space that we have learned in the justice community, how to hold people accountable, how to address racism, homophobia, patriarchy. We can be really good at accountability, but we're not oftentimes good at grace. And what I mean by grace is, how do I actually listen and hold someone else's truth? How do I sit with my own discomfort? And how do we dance between the two? Like, how do I know when to lean into grace and when I lean into accountability? But one or the other, like if we just use grace, we actually never create justice. And if we only use accountability, we never grow into our humanity. And so both of these tools, right? The ability for us to, sort of have a funky dance between accountability and grace, and knowing when to use which in different ways that we experience conflict, that we experience harm, that we experience joy. But both of those things are necessary.
And that's another thing that I really appreciated about the book and the work that you're doing as well, Farima, is this idea that, I mean, the good news in the last, I would say 20 years, and I'm speaking my experience in Canada, but I know it's in other places as well, is we used to have, the whole focus was on student achievement. And in the last 10 or 15 years, really thinking about schools being responsible for not only learning, but well-being. That's a good thing, right? We've also spent more time thinking about the kids that have had a tougher go in our schools. So we think about our Black and our brown children. We think about Indigenous children that have had a tough time in our schools in Canada. Think of kids, with learning exceptionalities, with gender differences, et cetera. So we're thinking more about those kids. And the one thing that I think that we have maybe done a mistake is that we get focused on the problems and kind of, saying how terrible it is, what we've done, et cetera. And what I love about your book and the work that you're doing is that you don't get stuck there. You talk about that need to kind of move into from the frenzy to the flow, from the problem to the possibility. Like, it's a really hopeful book, and it means that we can move forward. And that's what I'm really excited about, in these conversations, is there are a lot of people that really want to do the deep work so that we can move forward together for the sake of our kids.
Well, we are in a very delicate place in the United States right now. What I mean by delicate, I don't mean just that our democracy is at jeopardy, that the culture is shifting, where that we're normalizing the death and shooting of children as almost on a weekly basis. Okay. When schools are
so hard, Shawn. It's so hard to read the newspapers now, and our hearts are with you. That's for sure.
And the normalization of using as schools as places where children don't feel safe. It's always has existed in Black and brown communities, and now in white communities. But the normalization of that and the fact that we can't address that issue, Jennifer, we can't solve that problem. If we could solve it, we would have solved it. That is evidence that there are tools that we don't have as a society, not just as education. We don't have those tools. And so this book is a way of saying, look, y'all, if we really want to solve some of these tough problems, we have to be somebody different. We're not going to think our way out of these damn problems. We're not going to think our way out of it. These are deeply spiritual, humanistic issues. Like, we're trying to solve spiritual problems with technical tools. And so this is an opportunity for us to go deeper, to examine our own humanity and transformation, and what it takes for us to be able to practice and have a different perspective on how we need to engage in these things. I mean, I really hope people read the book. It was a joy to write and very hard to write. But it was my, it's the truth, right? Some of the examples in there are not something I read in research, right? They came out of my own life. And I had to ask permission from my children and my wife to share some of those stories. But I think that they illuminate some of the complexities of justice that we're all committed to, and how we all need to be able to develop those skills and those tools that broaden and expand and deepen our capacity to create the kind of society that we want to create.
For sure. And Farima, my wonderful colleague Urs has asked a question. He says, how much does emotional intelligence play in being able to achieve the balance between grace and accountability? And so it gets at this idea of, what are we doing in schools, and are we creating a learning environment for children to be developing that sense of emotion, that ability to be looking at themselves, to be thinking about who they want to be, et cetera?
And I would argue the question goes the same for, are we creating that environment for educators as well? Right.
Absolutely.
So one of the things about healing-centered engagement that I think is so important is that there is an emphasis that this is not something that we do for children. This is a culture shift. This is a way of seeing this as reciprocity, is that teachers deserve to have that space as much as young people deserve to have that space, because they're in relation. And so I continue as a teacher educator. I teach teachers at the University of San Francisco, right? And so we create space for that. I have an activity where they have to create vision boards of what would collective care look like in your classroom. What are rituals and routines and strategies that you can actually build into your classroom to make way for deeper relationships, to create space for joy, for rest, for self-regulation, right? And the same can be in the teacher's lounge or in PDs. Where's the space that we have to create room for rest, for joy, for meaning making, right? For relationship building. And so I do think that there's something about the culture of schooling, and I want to emphasize schooling is very different than education, right? Because we know education can happen anywhere, but there's a culture in schooling that is very much about punitive measures. It's very much about production, right? Shawn talks about moving from this like factory model to a greenhouse model of what is possible in education. And I think that is essentially what we're trying to do in healing-centered engagement with the 4 pivots, is really imagine, what if we do away with schooling as we know it and create the wellness visions that we have for our society in the small microcosms of schools and classrooms and organizations that we do have agency in to create shifts in.
And that's so, I'm really glad that you made that point, because even in our title, we were very specific about this, that this wasn't about just student well-being, it's creating student and teacher, or student and educator well-being. And in the district that I was in, we went out with a consultation out just to talk about, what are the skills and the characteristics that all of our community would like all of our kids, no matter what programs they were in, et cetera, to come out the other end of it. And it was, this is back in 2011. It was a while ago. And so even asking those questions was kind of an interesting one. And what came back to us from the principals and the teacher groups is they said, this isn't just about characteristics and skills of students. It's how will we invest in each other to help us as adults continue to grow those characteristics and skills. And what are you going to do? And it was a very fair question. What are you going to do as a school district to help us along that journey?
I also always love, Jennifer, to mention that just because we are adults doesn't mean that we aren't also children, because many of us are adult children that are still repairing wounds from our childhoods, right? Yeah. All of us have an inner child. All of us have an inner teenager that comes out from time to time. And so I think that's part of the healing work as well.
Well, and the good thing from a research standpoint, the OECD study on social emotional learning, the research that was done in that showed that the non-cognitive skills continue to develop all the way well into kind of middle adulthood, right? So it's a hopeful stance, right? I mean, that's what when we were talking about this in our school district, we said, this is good news for our secondary, for our high school teachers, right? Those kids that are coming in your door, they're not like a done deal. You've got their brains are developing and they know that, right? And the role that they can be played to helping them move along. And that's a hopeful stance, right? Tell me about, you talk about deeper system change. And we know we haven't done a good job on that. I'm sure you've seen examples of schools where you've seen real whole school change, from, you know, the leader in the school, the staff, the teachers, the community involvement, et cetera, where the kids having agency, that it actually looks different. And I'm sure you've seen some school districts where you think, okay, they're on the right path. Tell me a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, well, you know, our schools and the way that we're trained as educators and teachers and educational leaders is we are trained with a lens and a gaze to produce an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we see, like Farima's already mentioned this metaphor that I always use, which is the factory model is not just how we see schools, it's how we see the entire system. Inputs, do some stuff, but the gaze is the outputs of what comes out of that. Learning, you know, student achievement, and it's that's how we're trained, right? Mm-hmm. And so that way of training, that factory model of training has not produced, right? It just has not produced what we want it to produce, yet we still are locked into, and we still have faith that that system actually produces the thing that we want, and it doesn't. And so I propose that we just shift our framing and our thinking about what that system is. And so I use the metaphors factory to a greenhouse. And with a greenhouse, you're not so much focused. If you've ever been into a greenhouse, you don't focus on the output, like, are the plants high? Did they produce this fruit? No. What a greenhouse is you're focused on the conditions. You're focused on, is there enough water? What is the soil? You're focusing on the conditions, knowing that if the conditions are right, the outcomes are inevitable. If the conditions are right, the outcomes are inevitable. If there's enough soil and fertilizer and water and moisture and sunlight, that the outcome of what you put in that greenhouse, I don't have to worry about it. And I think that just shifting that and thinking about how we train educators and how we think about schools can have a profound impact on how we think about systems change, from trying to fix the widgets in the system, as opposed to focusing on the conditions where young people can be well and have the conditions of learning. And there's a lot of ways to define what are those conditions. And, you know, we could talk a little bit about that, but the basic premise here is, how do we be more human? Right? How do we create the capacity for us to fill up these systems with our humanity, in our policies, in our practices, in our curriculum, all of that. And in doing that, we don't have to worry about the damn DEI anymore, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because if we have a framework of our humanity, it's already there. It's already built in that everybody belongs, right? So I'll stop there.
Amazing. Farima, over to you, and then I'm going to ask a question from Jen in the chat.
Yeah, I think for me, I've been really recently being at the university that I'm at, I got tired of always having to deal with problems and it not being addressed, to be honest. And it got to a point to where, for me, I started to think about, okay, well, what are the problems that have been repeated, you know, over the years? And what are possible ways to intervene on these issues? And so I do think it's very context-based. But I think one of the problems was that teachers were getting burned out before even starting the profession. That's a huge problem for me. And if we don't create opportunities for teachers, pre-service teachers in particular, to think about their relationship and agency to wellness before they go, then chances are they're going to be the statistic that leaves the classroom within 5 years, right? So the way my brain thinks is I'm looking at root issues, but I'm also looking at the data, and I'm also thinking of the right now. And so doing things like disrupting, having healing retreats. We have a healing retreat coming up on Saturday with our teachers, right? And in this healing retreat, we're actually going to be exploring our agency. where in your schedule can you begin to imagine space for wellness that you need in your life? And who is an accountability partner that can support you in that process so that you actually engage in collective healing practices, right? If I know that some of our teachers are also dealing with interpersonal conflicts with their own students where they're getting triggered, this has been a repeated thing. They get triggered by their own students, right? How do we create capacity and room for them to understand their own triggers? What triggers? What happens when you're triggered? How do you self-regulate? Right? And so I just think that part of our job is to look at the complaints with a healing-centered lens and approach and say, okay, how do we take this complaint and see it as an opportunity for deeper learning, growth, and possibility, right? So that's some of the thoughts that come to mind.
Amazing. Lots of focus on that whole mindset piece, right? How do you help people develop the habits of thinking of the possibilities and giving time to themselves and et cetera? Yeah, that's great. A couple more questions here. Question from Jen. Shawn, how big of a factor do you think loneliness is for our staff and students? We have some kids and adults who are so isolated and alone, not connected to anyone or anything meaningful. Are you seeing this in your work?
Yeah, I never, well, I may have framed it differently, isolation and loneliness. But feeling isolated and not belonging is how I interpret it, right? I don't belong in the curriculum. I don't belong in the school. I don't feel safe as a gay and lesbian or transgendered young person, right? That is also a sense of loneliness and isolation. And so I think the phrase that you're talking about, lonely and isolated, or loneliness, is oftentimes an individual experience of something. And in my work, that sense of loneliness is a separation of my identity, right? That I'm not connected to a broader whole, or I don't belong. And so I'm suggesting that if you use the term loneliness, I'm sort of extrapolating that's not an individual experience for a lot of young people of color or queer young people, right? That sense of loneliness and separation is really a fact of not belonging. And so a healing-centered approach is about belonging, and it is about a radical belonging, and it is about calling out and having attention to the ways in which our systems and even ourselves, right? Even me in a college classroom, right? In my own college classrooms, what I do is say, I need some grace because I am a human being. And the fact that I'm a human being means that I'm not perfect, right? It means that I may inadvertently, because I was raised I was raised in a capitalistic, patriarchal, racist culture, right? So and I'm working on that, but what makes me immune from that? I'm not so I don't know, I'm kind of preaching here, but I guess what I'm saying is that we have to be able to practice this notion of belonging. And this is what our healing-centered strategies allow for us to do. It's hard work. This is not policy work. This is not a curriculum, though I will give you a link to a healing-centered toolkit in a few minutes here, if I could share my screen. But it is not just a curriculum. It is a way of being. It's a way that we see the world that gets translated into our classrooms and schools.
I do, if I can add too, there are ways that you can systematize relationships, right? So I think about when I was a kindergarten classroom, I partnered with a 6th grade classroom so that every single Friday, 6th graders would come get their kindergarten buddy, and they would engage in play, and they would read to their buddies, and they would have opportunities to relate differently. And now when I think about my teacher education classroom, I know that them navigating the teacher performance assessment is a very isolating and painful and torturous experience. So I created collective accountability squads where they can meet together and work on things together and support each other on their process. So I think anytime you see isolation or loneliness, whether it's an individual experience or a collective one that everyone is just having to deal with, there's opportunities also to create systems, routines, and rituals for folks to relate to one another on a deeper level as well. And that could look like check-ins before every class starts. It can look like a lot more partner and group work in a way that is more rooted in joy and deeper relation, right?
For sure. Back to the chat, M talks about that flower not blooming, and you don't fix the flower, you fix the conditions to feed the flower and make sure that flower is being fed. And when you think of our kids and our staffs in our schools, they need to be fed as well. Jean Clinton is an amazing child psychiatrist in just out of Hamilton, Ontario, and she talks about being honest about how does it feel to work with this kid? Where do you put your pain? The huge power of reflective practice, and really giving teachers permission to be thinking about that, right? Because sometimes we talk so much about what they have to be doing with kids, we don't let them have the time to be thinking about how that's impacting them and what we can be doing to support them as well.
Yep. And this is for Jean as well, is that there's this sort of mythology that we have as educators that we have the profession and then we have our personal life, professional life and personal life. And those two things should be separated. And that I'm going to give you professional development, right, to make you better professional to work with young people. But your personal life is whatever your personal life is. And we know that's such a myth, right? And so when we bring these things together, we understand the beauty and the messiness of our personal lives having an influence on our professional life. And by cultivating and giving folks the skills to be better human beings, we actually get a better professional. But it doesn't work the other way around, right? If I give you tools to deal with your trauma and your triggers, that makes you better to your pet, to your friends, to your partners, to your children. And guess what? You might actually be able to show up in a more profound ways for the young people, right? And so this is why I'm saying it's not just like, give me the tools so that I can work with the kids better in my school. No, this is a way that we see the world, a way that we see how we transform ourselves and transform our systems.
Shawn, I'm going to ask you to share that slide. I know that the participants would love to see some of the resources. And just as you're doing that, I'm going to conclude with a couple of slides as well. But, I love how both you and Farima have talked about humanity. And really, that's the business that we're in, right? Education, teaching, and learning is all about humanity. And I love how you always go back to that. So, Shawn, to your slide, if you can kind of describe.
So this is a toolkit. Folks can download the toolkit. It has a lot of the materials, like the framework that Farima shared is in there. The karma model is in there. There's some activities in there. But it's just a way to begin for folks to start thinking about how to use healing-centered strategies and approaches. The next slide is if there are folks that are curious and interested in actually receiving training and certification, this QR code gives you information about becoming a healing-centered practitioner, where you can actually go into, we have an online learning module that allows for folks to go in and learn more deeply through examples about how to use healing-centered engagement. And so both of these, Jennifer, if you want me to, leave you the deck, you can have it there. But that's the one for healing-centered engagement, certification and training. And then this one is a toolkit that you can download for free and take it and use it today.
That's great. And again, to the participants, we will send out in an email in the next couple of days your link to the on-demand version of that. So you'll be able to pull this up again. But yeah, Shawn, if you can send me the deck as well, that would be great. I'm going to ask my colleague Ryan just to share a couple of slides just before we wrap up. I did mention Signature Leadership is the one that you're on. Knowledge Hook is a digital math company out of Toronto. And they also have a math leader series. And so if you have math consultants, coordinators, teachers that are interested in this kind of learning, it is there and free of charge as well. One of the things that we have done looking at last year is we looked at some of the topics that came up over the year on these roundtables. And we realized that there was a lot of sessions that were on the topic of equity. And we've come up with the idea of an anthology. And if you click onto this, you'll be able to see, you'll be able to access that. And it's literally a one-pager from each of these academics and educators on the topic of equity. And I've already asked Shawn and Farima, the next one that's going to be coming out is on the topic of well-being. And I've asked Farima and Shawn to be willing to be one of the 10 educators, 2 of the 10 educators that I'll be highlighting in that. So that's coming up. Finally, we do podcasts as well. I don't know about you, but I have a tough time actually sitting down, and I'm actually better if I go out for a run to be able to be listening to podcasts. And Damien Cooper is a Canadian educator that's done some amazing work on assessment. And he's just won an international award for his latest version on classroom assessment called Rebooting Assessment. So this podcast has just been posted, and we are welcome to access that. So that's a little bit, that brings us to the end of the hour. Farima and Shawn, I can't thank you enough. It has been a fascinating conversation, and can tell by the comments in the chat, people really enjoyed listening to the work that you're doing and feel very connected to it. So thank you to you both.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone, for sharing space with us today.